Hey, happy Friday. Welcome back to another Friday Tech Workshop. I'm Joseph, a senior developer advocate with Appsmith, and this week we're going to check out AWS Lambda functions. In this example, I'll be building a REST API endpoint to generate those colored initial icons that you tend to see next to a contact name in Gmail or other platforms. I'll be using Python, but you can use this same approach to trigger a Lambda function that runs .NET or Node or Ruby or lots of other languages. So we'll start out by creating a new Lambda function and writing some Python code to generate those colored SVG initials. Then we'll enable the access token and copy that into an AppSmith data source. And then from there, we can use the Lambda function in our app to generate those colored initial icons for each user. So let's get started by first generating a Lambda function and then enabling the API gateway. All right, let's check it out. Okay, here's a quick preview of what we're going to build. You can see each row here has some initials generated from that user's first and last name. And when I select one of these, it's going to call the API again and get that particular one for the selected row. So I have it set up to work at an individual level if you just want to do one, or in bulk so you can populate the entire table. Now, let's take a look at the main part of the code that's generating the SVG. I don't want to cover all the Python in this one because this tutorial is more about just how to use a Lambda function, and that could be Python or Node or Ruby or .NET or whatever you want to use. But as far as the main piece of this, what we're doing is just taking a template here for this string of an SVG and merging in the color and the initials. So if I take this section here and run it with my initials, and we get back this string of an SVG, but it doesn't actually display here. So I'm going to copy this into a new tab here, and we'll put this in the URL, and you'll see that it's still not actually displaying. It's trying to Google it. But what if we start out with a data prefix? So it's data colon image and then the type, which is SVG plus XML text, and then the SVG, and that actually displays. So we're going to do something similar in AppSmith, getting back that string and then appending it with that extra data type so that it can become a data URL and be displayed in place of a image link. So in the table widget, when you've got a list of contacts, instead of displaying a profile pic, you can just give them a link to this SVG. And if you just give it that prefix, it'll actually display in the table. All right, so that's the main piece of the code. There's some more that's going to go with it as far as taking in the input string. I'm going to pass in the entire name and then have a function that converts that to initials. And the color, instead of asking for a specific color that you would have to do for, X number of rows, instead of having to pick a color and send that with each one, I've got it set up to just do it automatically, and it's repeatable. It's kind of random, but it's still repeatable. So the same name always has the same color each time. And then there's the code just to return it. So there's a little more going on the Python side, but we're not going to focus too much on that. This is more about just publishing a Lambda function and then being able to use those results in your app. So let's head over to AWS, and you can just use the search up here for Lambda. I've got it in my recently viewed already, but if you're looking for it and you're just starting out, just search for Lambda up here. And then from here, you'll want to create a new function. So give this a name. I'm going to say initials generator. And you can't have any spaces in here, so use a dash or an underscore or whatever. And then you'll want to change this runtime here, whatever version of Python you're comfortable with or based on the libraries that you're trying to use. And that's all I'm going to set from here. I'm using this author from scratch, a name, and Python 3.8. So you go ahead and create the function. And then this will bring up the editor so we can paste in some code here. And while that is finishing up, I'm going to head over to this tutorial so I can copy this code. This is the section you just saw, and this tutorial has the entire chunk of code here to do all of the parsing, get the parameters when they come in, turn it into an SVG, and then return it. So I'm copying that into the code section here, and I'll just replace everything that's in there. And then we could deploy this, but we don't have a way to trigger it yet outside of AWS. So the other thing that we want to do while we're here is add a trigger. And then we're going to select source and then choose API gateway. And then from here, we're going to create a new API using the HTTP method instead of REST. From Appsmith, we're going to use the REST API to connect to it. But in AWS, there are these two different options, and REST has a lot more capabilities, but it's also a little more expensive. If I remember right, it might be more like 10 times, so not just a little. So if you can get by with the HTTP one, go ahead and use that instead. Now for security, for this use case, I'm just going to use open and do this long enough to show it and then get rid of this function. You don't want to leave it open, but for your initial testing, maybe just to get the basics working, but you should definitely add that if you're going to leave it for an extended time or you're using it in production, unless you really need it to be public. So just to keep this example simple, I'm using open, but you don't want to do that for, for anything that you're exposing to the internet. So, all right, I'm going to add this function. We've got HTTP open, and we're creating a new one. There's also some settings here that you can turn on some metrics if you want to see some logging on it and disable cores. So let's go ahead and save this. This is going to enable the gateway now so that we have a way to trigger this. And if you open the gateway, once you have it set up, you can actually see the endpoint right here. So I'm going to go back to the code side now and deploy this. So we'll click deploy. And now the function is ready to interact with either through the Appsmith AWS Lambda integration, or you can just use this endpoint. So if we go to this URL, you'll see full name parameter is required. So I've set up the code to expect a parameter called full name. And if I say the full name is equal, I put in my name with a space, you can see it has converted that space to the %20, it's URL encoding it. And then the script gets that, parses the full name string, turns it into the initials, and returns that SVG. So the basics are working, the script is published, it's out there, and it's not requiring any login. So that much works. Now, to connect from Appsmith, we need to enable a access key first. So to get that, just go to the user section up here, the profile menu, and go to security credentials. And then from here, you can create an access key. Now, I am logged in with an account that's not actually going to, it's root, and I don't want to make it from here because that would give it full access. You can either log out and log in with the AIM account to create your access key and have it more restricted that way. But then your IAM user has to have those permissions to create an access key. Or you can go view a user and create a key for them. So the other way is you find that user that's not the root user, and then from here you can just create their security credentials. So I'm not going to go through the entire thing. There are some more details in the tutorial over here, but basically you just want to create that set of credentials. It'll give you back an access key and a secret, and you'll see the secret when you actually go to create it and save it. So you'll need those two values, the access key and the secret that it gives you when you first create it, and then leave that page open. You'll want to do something else in AppSmith and come back and copy both those values, so you can't have them both on the clipboard at once. So I would just leave that open and then come over to AppSmith. I'm going to go to a new page so we can start building this from scratch. And you will go to data, choose the plus here to create a new data source, and then select AWS Lambda. And then from here, you can just paste in those two values, the access key and secret, and you don't need the region for this case. I haven't done too much with AWS Lambda, but for everything I've tried so far, it works without the region. If you run into any errors, you might try adding that as well. And then you'll also see another option here for instance role for the login. Just make sure you're on access key. So once you save that data source, I'm going to back out because I already have one set up. Then you select the data source and add a new API underneath it. So I'm going to add a new one to this page of the app because I've started out with that's a mostly blank page, and the only thing I have is an API for a list of users. So I'm displaying them in a table here, and I want to add that column for the initial icon. Now, first what we'll do is just set this up for a single row of data, single user, and we'll just take that row that's selected. And so I'm going to put that person's name here. We're going to take the table one.selected row, and then they have name first and last. So inside name, there's first. And if we put a template literal around this, then we can add our space and then just copy this for the last name. All right. So now as I select different rows, you can see the user up here that's selected. And we want to take that name and send it to our new Lambda function so that it will return that initial icon. So back to the query, we're adding a new API underneath this AWS data source now. And from there, you'll be able to either list all the functions in your account, or you can pick a specific one and run it. And so I already had one version of this thing built. So I think initials generator is the one that I just now created. And I'm going to run it without any info in here just to see what we get. Okay, it says body full name parameter is required. So let's go back to the tutorial and just double check the formatting here. It's a little different than a regular API because you're putting the query parameters, the URL parameters, actually in the body. It's just a different way to send all the info over. So when we trigger this, we need a object that has a query string parameters property, and then that's another object with the individual key value pairs that you would put in the URL if you were using it the way we did here. If you're just going to the URL of it and using the regular REST API endpoint, then it's in the URL parameter. But we're sending it in the body with a property called query string parameters. So that's one thing. The other is that it needs to be a string for the Lambda function to accept it. So we're not sending it as JSON. We're going to stringify it first. So I'm going to copy all of this, put that into the body, and now when we run it, we get back our SVG. So we want to make this dynamic. I'm going to swap this out for the values from that text widget. I'm just going to use the exact same template literal from here. We'll copy that and put that in the body here. And so now we're getting back an SVG with the selected user's initials. And from here, I can display this. So I'm going to put this into a image widget. So first, we'll just try to get the results directly from that API.data. And you can see here, there's data in it, but it's not displayable. So we need to get to that body. And if I try to go to .body, all right, it's still trying to display something here, but it's not quite working because this is coming back as a string. Now, when you view it, AppSmith is kind of helping you out and adding the color formatting, and it looks like JSON, but it's actually a string that needs parsed into JSON. So we'll put the parentheses around here, use JSON.parse. And then once it's parsed into JSON, it's still not quite ready to be displayed as an image. So the other thing that we need around this is the data URL prefix. I'm going to wrap all of this one more time and turn it into base64. So that's A to B. And then it needs that data URL prefix. And so right here we have data : image slash SVG and XML. And then this is base 64. Actually, that's B to A to go to base 64. There it is. All right, so we got some initials. I think we just need to make this contain now. There we go. So as I select a different one, this one's updating because it uses the selected row, but the API isn't rerunning yet. So we can go to the row selection and turn on row select, recall that API. And there we go. So now it's calling the API every time we select a different user, and we're getting back a single image. But what if you want to do all of them at once and show the whole row in the table? So for that, what we're going to do is first we'll add a calculated column here, a custom column. And so we'll use this one for the initials and set its type to an image. And then where are you getting that URL? Well, again, we're going to use a template literal. And inside of here, I'll put the address for that endpoint. So we're going back to Lambda functions now. And to our new Lambda function into the API gateway section here. Okay, here's the URL we need. So every row should be hitting this address to get the image, but then you need a question mark for the query parameter, full name, and then the user's full name. Got to have an equal sign there. And then we can take the name from here. So here's a template literal string. I'm just getting the piece inside the backticks, and we'll copy that. And back here. Oh, and now I can't use table 1 selected row because I'm in the table. I want to use current row. All right, there it is. So now we have a bulk method of pulling all those images at once for the whole table. And this is repeatable. Even though the colors are kind of randomly assigned, you can look at the code. It's not quite random. It's using the hash. But you don't have to worry about specifying a color for 100 different users. And you know it'll be the same next time so that your end users get used to seeing, certain names or whatever color. So this takes the work out of that part, generates it for you automatically. The one thing I'd add here is this was just a quick demo of how to connect to a Python Lambda function. For this particular use case, if you were going to do this, I would save those images back to the database. Like only request it once to be generated, and then you can store it. And then you're not hitting that API every time the page loads for every user, because that's probably going to get expensive fast if you have a lot of end users. But if you just use a service like this on the first time that the record's created, or the first time a user views it, if the initials field is empty, then you could get back that image and save it, and then it'll be a lot more performant, and you don't have to worry about that cost. So that's everything I wanted to cover for this week. We went over how to create an AWS Lambda function, how to deploy it, and use the API gateway to create a new REST API endpoint. And then from there, you can connect from your Appsmith app using the native Lambda integration, or just using the regular endpoint if you need to make it dynamic and pass in values in bulk. So that's everything for this week. If you have any questions or ideas for future workshops, feel free to drop a comment below. Thanks again for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next week.